Well, let's talk now to Sean Bell, who's a British retired Air Vice-Marshal and military analyst. Good to see you, Sean. Welcome back to the programme. So where does this wave of attacks sit in the context of this war? How bad is it?
Well, first of all, it's the biggest attack that's happened since the war begun. I mean, President Zelensky announced that 122 missiles were launched from Russia in a sort of simultaneous attack. If you look at the record books, back in November last year was the biggest to date, was 96. So going over 100 in one sustained attack. And this was a mix of the sort of Shahed 136 drones, the sort of slow speed 100-mile-an-hour drones that are relatively simple to shoot down, all the way up through ballistic missiles, up to the hypersonic missiles. And although, as you said, Ukraine is getting better at shooting these things out of the sky, inevitably the wreckage still falls down and the explosives often still detonate. They just don't hit their intended target. And although, as you said, the casualty rates keep climbing, as I understand it, the latest figures are now 22 people killed, 86 injured. But if you look at some of the wreckage and the carnage that's been wreaked, there are antenatal hospitals, there's schools, there are residential areas. I suspect those figures will rise in the coming hours.
So why has it happened now? Is it in response to anything in particular?
Well, inevitably, I think as a military analyst, I'm always looking at the why question. Now, ultimately, Putin and his military experts will be only people who know what, how, or why, sorry. But one thing to be sure is they've been short. Russia's been very short of cruise missiles and missiles in general. So it does raise the question of why they've suddenly launched such a surge. Three main reasons jump to mind. About a year ago, Russia was targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, bluntly, just to make life as miserable as possible for the Ukrainian people. It didn't work last year, not quite sure why it's going to work this year. Second reason is Russian retribution. Russia lost another one of its landing ships, the Russian Navy ships, and that now means that Ukraine has destroyed 20% of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and that's a Ukraine that doesn't actually have a credible navy at the moment. The third reason, though, from a military perspective, these waves of attacks are normally associated with some big ground offensive. Now, neither side is really ready for another ground offensive. Ukraine's has stalled, but Russia throughout this summer has kept its focus on the Donbass region. We heard on Christmas Day that they'd actually seized Marinka, which is just in the south, and it looks likely that despite the winter fighting, despite the massive casualties, Russia is still focused on that as a priority of President Putin's special military operation. So it could be actually part of that continued attack.
And you talked about those massive casualties. Recent US intelligence suggesting Russian losses so far are more than 300,000 troops. You mentioned some of those Navy ships being destroyed. With all that in mind, can Russia carry on this conflict at this level?
The short answer is yes. Russia is a major superpower. It has access to hundreds of thousands, millions of people if it wants to throw more people at the fight. What's been interesting from a media perspective, we tend to focus on the ships being destroyed, Ukrainian attacks on Crimean ports or Russian oil infrastructure. But the harsh reality is the metric of success, the only one that really counts in this conflict, is territory regained. And over this last year, Ukraine, despite having a massive support from the West, has really not translated that onto gains on the ground. And Russia has managed to withstand that onslaught. You have to look at it sort of grand strategically, that Ukraine is a relative David to Russia's Goliath, and unless Ukraine manages to retain the support of the West, which obviously is stalling a bit at the moment, it will be very vulnerable if the war continues.
So can it, do you think, keep that international support going? Ukraine, of course, has suffered losses too on the battlefield. Is there still international backing for Kyiv?
I think that from a moral perspective, of course there is. You won't see any of the international leaders doing anything other than providing fulsome support. But I think it's worth looking back. At the start of this conflict, the West was very concerned that Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine actually might be the start of a much bigger grand plan. And of course, Europe's seen two world wars emanate from a similar sort of starting point. And that's why they got involved. Ukraine's not a member of NATO, but the West provided a lot of military support. If you wind the clock forward now almost 2 years since the start of the conflict, Russia has been badly decimated by the Ukraine war. It's lost over 2,000 battle tanks. It no longer poses that same threat to Europe as it once did. And therefore, inevitably, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, can the West continue to support Ukraine to the same level as it did last year? The answer is it will struggle to do so, given conflicting domestic priorities. So the pressure is building on President Zelensky. And of course, the distraction of the Israel conflict hasn't helped him either.
Sean, great to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us today. That's Sean Bell, the military analyst.